Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first event in our Evolution of Work Summit. For all of this week, we will be doing a different webinar on a different topic, posting all sorts of different content all over social media for every day of this week. So you've got us here today talking about diversity. And I have got an absolutely amazing panel here today to chat in their respective areas, different areas of expertise. And I'm really excited to give this to bring this discussion together and hopefully provide you with some really interesting insights and points of view. If you haven't been to one of our webinars before, I'm Molly. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Flexa. And Flexa is the platform that enables companies to get discovered for all of the things that makes them unique and enables our users to discover companies based on the kinds of things that they say are non-negotiables or will make them thrive. And to give some relevance to, why we're having this discussion around inclusive hiring and diversity, it's because we've been incredibly lucky to amass an audience of over 3 million users, but they are incredibly diverse. So to put that into context, around 72% of our user base is female, which for a professional platform is incredibly high. Around 31% of our users are ethnically diverse, 25% are LGBTQ+, around 19% identify as having a disability or a chronic condition, and around 27% identify as being neurodivergent. So because of the fact that so many companies on Flexa are being honest and transparent about what's on offer at their organization before people apply and before people join, we have enabled companies to hire more inclusively and as a result amass an incredibly diverse group of people on a professional platform. And before we kind of kick off with a few introductions, I just wanted to tell the story of why we started Flexa, because it, again, gives some context and reality as to why we're here having this discussion, and hopefully also lets you know, why should you listen to me? So the reason that we started Flexa and launched in February 2020 was because of a very personal experience that I had in investment banking, which is not the most flexible nor inclusive environment that I could have joined. But back in my early 20s, I wanted to work as hard as possible and earn as much money as possible. That was all I cared about. And around the same time that I got into that career, I was diagnosed with a really severe autoimmune condition that means that I'm technically classified as disabled. And sadly, those two things didn't really go hand in hand, going into the office 6 days a week, working 14, 16-hour days. I'm sure many of you have experienced similar things in similar industries. But when I couldn't walk about once a week, it was effectively impossible. It didn't stop me working, but stopped me going in. And after about 18 months of struggling through, they said to me, well, you can put in a request to work from home one day a week and, we're really open to flexible working. About 10 days later, I had a settlement package put in front of me and I was sacked and told to leave immediately. So they obviously weren't open to flexible working in that way. And I was then plunged into the job hunting process, just like billions of other people have gone through. And that experience made me want to change the way that people look for jobs and the way that people find information about companies. Hence why we started Flexa. But that's enough about me. I am delighted to introduce my expert panel in front of me here. I won't introduce them because I won't do their skills and their expertise justice. But first of all, Raj, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Molly. Hi everybody. I'm Raj Gill. I work for BT. So I lead the talent acquisition function for what is known as BT Business. In particular area of that is the service operations team that I kind of support. I've worked in recruitment for over 10 years and have had the opportunities to work in both agencies, RPO, and setting up in-house functions. And I think I'm quite passionate about this topic, not only from a how do I make sure that I've got 2 young children, so I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. So how do I make it an inclusive environment for them for the future? But also just being a woman in a leadership role of colour, how do I make sure from the inclusive perspective those doors open up? So lovely to be here and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Lovely to hear the kind of context and why you're passionate about it as well. Kate, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, fabulous. So I'm Kate Parkinson and I work for Microsoft. I lead our talent acquisition teams across EMEA, so Europe, Middle East and Africa, and focused around that kind of industry or experience high layer. I have I'm almost like your twin, Raj, because I also have 2 young children. They're 8 and 6, so really similar ages. And similarly, I've been really privileged to work for organisations that have allowed and enabled part-time working, flexible working, condensed hours, and feel really, really passionate about creating spaces where everybody can come to work and thrive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Reena.
Thank you, Molly. It's lovely to be joining Raj and Kate and you today. So I'm Reena. I am the founder and CEO of Being Inclusive, which is a neurodiversity consultancy. In a former life, I was a solicitor, and then I worked as an ombudsman, and I specialised in cases which involved discrimination, race and disability in particular. And 3 years ago, I set up my consultancy, and it was inspired by my journey through neurodiversity, starting with my oldest son's autism diagnosis when he was 5. And I now have a younger son as well, who is autistic, ADHD and PDA. And so, as well as having living experience of being neurodivergent, it's been quite an interesting journey. And my mission is to create environments where parent carers of neurodivergent children feel that they can bring their whole selves to work, but also to generate neurodiversity awareness and inclusion in organisations so that neurodivergent talent is nurtured. There's a strengths-based approach taken to it, so you can really get the best out of your people.
Wonderful, thank you. That's such an inspiring story. Something to come out of, I guess needing to make that career change, but then turning it into something that's obviously benefiting the world for the better. So thank you very much for sharing those stories with me. And it's also worth mentioning that both BT Group and Microsoft have taken the step to be verified by Flexa and to be super transparent about all of the great things that are on offer, and have scored brilliantly across areas like flexibility, like senior leadership role modelling, like work-life balance, etc. So you can head to Flexa and check out BT Group and Microsoft as well. So to kick things off, the kind of all-important very first question of sort of why we're here today, and a question that I get asked quite often is, how do we define diversity? I feel like, we've moved beyond just seeing diversity as being gender or being ethnicity, and we've started to recognise and weave in all sorts of different areas of diversity. So Raj, from an organisational and like a personal viewpoint, like how would you define diversity?
So I think you're right, especially if I bring it from a BT angle as well, we've tried to embed it into more to our TA strategy. Yeah. And we're changing the way from thinking from having a D&I lens to having more of an inclusive lens. So although we have, and I'll probably touch on it maybe later in the session, but we've got core characteristics that we may target and we look after at the moment. Actually, what we're trying to do is creating a culture which is more inclusive. And I think that brings me back to your question around what does it mean to me? It's not just there's one area that I think we need to focus on. It's more around how can we make sure that organisations build a culture where you can be yourself and you can bring your whole self to work without being judged of what your background is or what your cultural aspects that you've come from. So how can it be more inclusive? And you can be you, regardless of the role that you're in.
Yeah. And that's a brilliant definition. Kate, would you have anything to add, or anything sort of from Microsoft's perspective as well as to how you consider it?
Yeah, so Microsoft is going into its 50th year actually, and so they've been at this a long time, sort of in terms of the way that we think about it. And I like where you're going there, which is, I think for many organisations, diversity sort of started maybe from a kind of compliance perspective. We need to do something to meet some regulatory, the policy around it. And I think how we like to think about it is moving from a place of compliance to a point of conviction. So we all collectively understand why this is important and how it benefits all of us. So it becomes less around diversity or diverse and more about everyone benefiting in terms of that kind of inclusive piece. So moving from compliance to conviction, and then hopefully in the future, the long-term goal of that really being just the way we do things and part of our culture.
Yeah, it being truly embedded rather than being a tick box. I think that's such an important step for organisations to make. And Reena, obviously from your perspective as a consultant and an expert, particularly on neurodiversity, like how have you seen diversity evolve?
So I think there's the fact that we're talking about neurodiversity, because for a long time that was restricted to, it was very pathologized and very restricted to medical worlds. But I think overall, build on the points that Raj and Kate have made, it's true diversity will acknowledge the systems and structures which exist in society, which perpetuate inequity. Yeah. So it's not just about the person in front of you, but all of those systems and structures behind them, which have perhaps meant that they have not had equitable access to opportunity, education, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. When somebody asks me, how can we solve gender inequality within society? And I'm like, well, how long do you have? Like, there's the systems, the structures, starting even from before birth, like we are subject to these biases, these expected ways of behaving that ultimately then contribute to the situation that we're in now. So I think that's a really important thing to unpick and to bear in mind when we're talking about this subject.
And our cultural context continues to change and continues to shift. So we're constantly reframing, is how I would sort of position it, the way in which we're viewing a really difficult and complex topic.
Yeah, exactly that. I guess, Kate, actually, I'd love to hear from you from Microsoft's perspective of, like, you mentioned about moving from sort of the tick boxing to proper conviction and really embedding it in your hiring strategies. What strategies have you found effective in attracting candidates from underrepresented groups, and maybe even more importantly, not just attracting but retaining as well?
Yeah. So I think sort of two parts of this. So we concentrate a lot around our own GTA, Global Talent Acquisition, the team I look after the capability, because sort of we strongly believe that we are this kind of culture carrying role, right? At every interaction that we might have with a hiring manager, we have a chance to influence and in turn the behavior and the culture of the organization. So really for us, building that culture around understanding the why around our journey from an internal talent acquisition perspective, and then actually embedding that within our hiring manager community. So for example, our inclusive hiring training, and that's something that we track. We kind of constantly look at participation rates against that, because we know, like, no organizations are kind of monolith. We've got new people coming in, we've got new people being promoted. It's a constant journey in terms of how we sort of educate around that. So actually steadying and readying ourselves is super important in terms of that journey from the sort of compliance to conviction. And then you talked about sort of tick box. It's like we've sort of moved from doing, having maybe diversity on the panel or doing some very sort of what I would call kind of tactical things into more of a space around what would it look like to widen the talent aperture in this space? So how can we be a little bit more broad in terms of the way that we go out in terms of what we're looking for? And that might be by providing some programmatic vehicles, for example, where we can sort of give people insight into our organization and how to interview before coming into a process, for example. And it might just be around providing sort of training and upskilling in advance of those opportunities being available. So just many, many ways in which we're doing it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think taking that to your point, that transparent approach, not just on like what you offer and helping people to make an educated decision about whether your company is right for them, but through interview. Some people thrive in environments where they've got some time to prep based on the questions that they'll be asked. How can somebody not feel blindsided by a process that they didn't understand? So it's great to hear that you're thinking about it through kind of all of those different aspects. Reena, obviously in your role as kind of advising and consulting on this, what are the strategies that sort of you've seen, whether that's through research or whether obviously people that you've worked with, that have been effective in terms of attracting and retaining candidates from underrepresented groups?
Yeah. What I love about this question is it's not just about the attraction, the retention, because what the data shows us, particularly research that was done last year and this year by Burke University, is that even though there are lots of initiatives around getting neurodivergent people into work, but actually where the infrastructure isn't there is a really high fallout rate, and not just in terms of the workplace, but actually in terms of well-being as well. So you can have, it can be as bad as a neurodivergent person exiting the workforce altogether if they've had such a poor experience. So I think there's lots of different things organizations can do in terms of attracting candidates, including ensuring that they're using inclusive language in their promotional materials, and talking about having a welcoming, diverse experience, really actively using platforms and communities to share opportunities, the types of platforms and communities where neurodivergent people hang out, disability-focused job boards, things like that. There's fantastic organizations like Even Break and others that support in this space. And really emphasizing that inclusive culture in recruitment materials as well. Don't keep it a secret. Tell people what you do. There's not, it's sometimes I think, why is it so hidden? It's as if you don't want people to know, but really you do. You want to, that transparency is actually attractive and makes a person feel more likely that they can put themselves forward. And also, if you offer anything flexible in terms of interview processes, and maybe we'll talk about interviews generally, perhaps later in the conversation, but just say that you do, that flexible interview formats and alternative options to interviews too are a great way to attract neurodivergent candidates.
Awesome. Some really, really good tips and advice there. And I think your point that you mentioned about sort of showcasing people in those environments is so important. Like, people resonate with seeing themselves.
Representation is so important. And, if you can even share stories of people in your organization, positions they have, and, if they're happy to share their own neurodivergence, great.
Yeah. Super important. And I know some organizations are really leading from the front by sharing like the proportion of their workforce that are neurodivergent, or being really, really transparent about generally the diversity makeup of their organization. But I do think that sort of employee representation and telling those stories and enabling people to relate with the idea of like, oh, I can see myself there. And that's actually something that BT Group are fantastic at. I've seen some of your video content, and we use it on a team day as one of our examples of one of our favorite kind of employer branding content was the kind of carers video, and it literally brought a couple of people to tears. So I'll hand over to the experts here in terms of, how are you using things like the employee representation and employee stories in attracting really diverse groups?
So I think even when we watched the carers video that came out, there's many of us in the office that were kind of in tears, just because I guess it hit home to so many people and it was so relatable. But we've also, one of the other, I guess, video contents that we're doing at the moment is the Her campaign, which some of you may have seen on LinkedIn. That's gone kind of viral and live at the moment. But it is all about celebrating stories. And what we've tried to do is we've really tried to get different career levels involved. So we've got one of our directors, but we've also got apprentices as well, and to kind of celebrate what are they doing not only from their work life, but what is their role outside of work. So some people are in volunteering clubs, some people have some kind of caring duties, some people are a kind of single parents, and kind of really kind of flexibility is quite key for them to make sure that they're able to go and bring themselves to work, be inclusive, all of from that aspect of things. And I think at the moment, we've launched 7, and we're still continuing to launch them as the months go by. And I think since we have launched them internally, it's landed really, really well. I think there is an openness to kind of learn more about what the lives of people kind of look like. And we are inundated with requests coming through from other internal employees saying, well, actually, I've got a story to tell. And can you use that to bring it to life from a BT perspective? And can I share my story? Yeah. And I think even that alone, in August alone, we've seen an increase at the top of the funnel applications, particularly from females, by at least kind of 4%. And that's kind of had a knock-on effect throughout the funnel. Yes. So all of this kind of stuff that we do, even when we did the family carers policy, which was quite new, everything seems to get a good buying behind it, and the employees are really engaged with it. And I think we've now got to a point where we've really adapted a culture that if something doesn't feel right, people feel quite open to kind of stand up and call it out and say, well, actually, this doesn't feel right. What are we doing as an organisation to put it right?
Yeah, that's super, super powerful. You've got such an amazing tool at your hands if you have got that desire for employees to advocate and to share their stories. And I think it was so, it's a really good point that you made around trying to do that at all levels. So having, apprenticeships all the way through to obviously women in C-suite roles and senior leadership, because to Reena's point earlier, right, like so many of the problems that we face are systemic, and we can't expect to suddenly have loads of women in senior leadership when they weren't brought up through the kind of process and throughout their careers. So at every single point in the life cycle, it's so important for us to be supporting, to be reflecting, to be thinking, how can we make our working environments more inclusive and enable those people to thrive at every step.
And I think it's just having that, awareness that just because you may be in a more lower level role, it doesn't mean that you don't have other responsibilities outside of work. And it might be a reason to kind of juggle everything is the reason why you're happy to quite stay in that role. So we're quite open to kind of juggling all of that and really showcasing at all levels just to bring that to life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all that insight. As I said, I'm a big fan of all of the employer brand content you put out. I think it's really, really, really good. So the next question that I'd like to ask, kind of very often, I think when we talk about diversity, some people will use the words, oh, it's a bit fluffy, or like, how do we measure its impact? Or, is it really one of those things that, we can measure and see ROI from? I find that very frustrating because ultimately all we're saying is that we're trying to create an environment in which all people can thrive and all people are treated equally. Surely there is always something kind of measurable success from that. And we've obviously seen that there's so much research that suggests actually companies that are diverse do perform better because they have more diversity of thoughts, of experience, more adaptability. But from a more micro level and more day to day, how would you say you're measuring diversity, or how do you think it should be measured? Reena, I'd love to come to you first.
Sure. Can you measure diversity on a day-to-day level? Personally, I don't think you can, but I'm always open to hearing other opinions. I think there are ways you can measure. For example, through your retention rate, as I mentioned earlier. So how many of your people who are leaving are neurodivergent have shared? Bear in mind, there's a broader conversation here around the fact that lots of global majority people will not necessarily feel safe to share, or may not even have a neurodivergent diagnosis. So it's never as simple as the number who share equals the number who are neurodivergent, which is why as well I don't think we should be focusing only on initiatives for neurodivergent people, as opposed to actually focusing on a culture that feels inclusive for all, based on their learning and cognitive styles. But obviously I need to answer the question, so I will answer the question. So I think retention rates is one, and the research from Burke does back up that where there's insufficient accommodations for employees and limited career progression, and there's a lack of psychological safety, this really massively impacts the retention of neurodivergent people in the workforce. Also, looking at questions around how people are feeling, having accessible resources, basically employee engagement. Lots of organizations survey their people and then don't do anything with the results.
Yes.
And so people get survey fatigued, and then they don't fill them in anymore, or there's like a conspiracy theory maybe that, people might be outed, and it's really sad because actually sometimes that can happen. And actually, if you have a mechanism by which you're collecting this feedback and actually showing that you're doing something about it and you're okay with sharing, being vulnerable and saying, as an organization, we see this as a development point that we're willing to commit some time and energy and resource to, that actually goes a long way towards buy-in. Neurodivergent employees in particular are known for being exceptionally loyal to their employers. So having that transparency can really work in your favor. And I think also just finally, though there's many things I probably could add to this, but just looking at career progression over time. There are situations that I've seen where neurodivergent people are in the organization, are doing well, but they're not progressing. And there are lots of reasons for that. Sometimes it's inconsistency in understanding of neurodiversity across the manager population. There are other reasons too, but it's really worth looking at, who's moving where, which people are moving and which people aren't.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And Raj, at BT, how are you measuring the success of your diversity initiatives, your inclusive hiring strategies? Are there any things that you can share with us there?
Yeah, so I guess from a strategy perspective, we do things like diverse shortlisting, so we'll always get kind of the stats from that perspective to understand what we can do more of. We've kind of looked at different ways to make sure that when we're shortlisting individuals to go over to managers, we have got that diverse pool of application. I guess that triggers from a lot of the attraction to make sure we've got the right attraction in place to make sure the shortlist kind of comes through. But similar to what Reena said, we do rely heavily on our retention figures and understanding the reasons why they've left the business, but also our colleague satisfaction survey. There are some questions in there that will target whether our employees think it's an inclusive place to work. And off the back of that, we are targeted to make sure that from a team perspective, each team or each department sits down and understands and really kind of goes into a little bit of detail, digests some of the results that have come out of the survey and put an action plan in place to make sure that for the next survey that comes up, what is that improvement plan looking like? So there is a kind of constant focus moving forward. And we have kind of changed the way the surveys go out. So every second survey is more detailed, whereas I guess the middle one that goes through is just a quick, say 2 or 3 questions, so people don't get that survey fatigue, and there's enough time in there to make sure that you have some tangible actions to deliver on before it's time to complete the survey again.
Super, that's really, really useful kind of tangible ways of doing that. So thank you for sharing. And Kate, what about at Microsoft? Are there any kind of measures or things that you're looking at to understand the efficacy of your strategies and your initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, so very similar from a kind of listening tools, right? So we have a twice yearly listening system, and then we have what we call a daily pulse, right? So it's that real kind of short, real-time feedback around topics, which gives us a window into, yes, you know, do we feel like we're in a, you know, diverse and inclusive team environment, but also questions like, have you seen allyship in the workplace, for example, which is really sort of giving us a real-time sense of how some of our work is landing. I think just from a kind of representation perspective all up as well, it is a top line figure, but it's important to understand what that kind of representation looks like, because it allows us to understand how well we're tracking around some of our ambitions, and is really sort of, it holds us accountable. I think fundamentally, and we take our responsibility as a big employer that is quite transparent in the way it reports its data. We take that responsibility really strongly. So I think it's important that we're out there sharing where we are from the communities that we are able to track and that we could talk about, and that we hold ourselves accountable for that.
And exactly as you said, I think it's unusual to see such large organizations such as Microsoft and BT taking that very, very transparent approach and really leading from the front and being like, we're happy to share what we're doing in situations like this. It's very refreshing to see that, because I think often when people think about large multinationals and corporates, they think, oh, it's a black box. Like, I don't know if I can see myself there. Like, everything's so opaque. It's sort of just seen as a desirable place to get a job because of reputation, but actually you're taking those steps to help people to imagine themselves in those environments, which I think is super important. And I'd like to touch on something that you said there, Reena. Like, obviously some people aren't comfortable with necessarily kind of disclosing their diversity data. And I know from speaking to hundreds of our users that very often, if they are neurodivergent or they do have disabilities, or sadly, you hear of people changing their names to sound more Western, or people changing their names to gender neutral in order to try to give themselves a better chance in the application process, which I think is a very damning indictment of the situation that we're in, and the fact that people do still have to consider those things. But I think it's a very important point to say that, I've spoken to companies that say, oh, but we collect all that data at the point of application. That's enough. We're measuring the impacts, therefore, because we know who's applying. So many people aren't comfortable disclosing exactly what demographic kind of categories they would fall into. So making sure that there are opportunities for people to opt out, for people to disclose that anonymously at a different point in time, perhaps, so that you're actually getting representative data from the very, very top of the funnel all the way through to then who you are retaining, exit interviews and beyond. So there's a whole sort of employee life cycle of which it's very important to sensitively collect that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And and you can understand if you're from a marginalized background, and already you are, perhaps the odds are stacked against you from a societal point of view in getting that job in the first place. You're not going to necessarily share something that you perceive might be used against you, that might hamper your opportunity of getting that job. And the research that was published last year showed that a very small percentage, only 11% of people, employees in the workplace who shared their diagnosis, didn't face some resulting discrimination as a result. Wow. So it is really relevant. It's never just a moment in time. And I can see why someone might choose to be in an organisation, get to know them, almost put the feelers out, see how receptive the organisation is, if it's actually as inclusive as it says on paper, before they go that forward and share something as personal as a diagnosis. But all I just wanted to say is, I had a point. I'll bring it up later. I can't remember what it is, and I'm not going to stall. So
that's absolutely fine.
Sorry, Molly, I was just going to say, I think on that point, from a names perspective, I personally have gone through that. So not whilst I've been at BT, but in previous life, I have applied for roles using my full name, which is Rajveer, and I was never called. Whereas if I then did create a different CV with a completely different name, and I was kind of shortlisted to interview, and I don't know if there was something around not knowing how to pronounce names. Or there was an element of that, but I guess from that perspective, I was just a little bit taken back.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same experience, exactly the same companies, pretty much exactly the same CV. It's just the name that was at the top that was different.
Jesus, I'm so sorry to hear that. Like, it's actually, I always find it so shocking. Like, I know that kind of thing happens all the time, and I hate to use the word shocking because, you know, obviously it is a problem that genuinely exists, but it is incredibly upsetting, and it shows us how much work there is to do in order to educate people and to stop that kind of bias happening before you've even got in the door, just from a blind screening perspective, which is absolutely horrendous. I guess, you know, when talking about applications and hiring and job descriptions, how do you ensure that, obviously we talked about inclusive language, but how do you ensure that your process from discovery to application, those requirements and things are inclusive and they don't inadvertently discourage diverse candidates from applying? Raj, I'd love to start with you there.
Yeah, so I think we do use kind of platforms like Gender Decoder to make sure that we are using inclusive languages, and there's particular words that are more attractive to men as opposed to females and that kind of thing. So making sure that everything sounds quite, I guess, open to both or open to all backgrounds. I guess the other thing we've really kind of tried hard is really challenging managers on what is essential versus desirable, and what is trainable versus non-trainable, and really kind of taken that to put it in the job adverts, and really kind of, instead of having a list of 10 different essential skills that's needed, how likely is that skill needed for the role, and how do we move towards maybe a skills-based hiring principle and look at more at transferable skills as opposed to being a 10 out of 10 candidate as they're coming through the door. And that hasn't been an easy journey, if I'm honest, because it's kind of changing the culture, changing the I guess the legacy mindset of managers of how they've recruited to date. But actually what we have seen off the back of that is a broad range of candidates coming forward that are fully capable of performing the duties of the roles.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And we do the same at Flexa, actually, where we split our requirements into must-have, and we try to make that as short as possible, and then nice to have. And we say, like, you don't need all of these, but, you know, we'd like to have some from bucket A and some from bucket B, ideally.
I think it's even challenging from do you actually need a degree or a particular qualification?
Yeah.
Because not everybody is able to go through from that kind of background. So how do we make sure we look at qualified by experience as opposed to qualification as well? So really kind of opening the mindset.
Yeah, exactly.
To think a bit differently.
Because very often, like, I know for a fact that I could have done something much more useful than do geography at university in terms of what I do now. I can't even name capital cities and facts. So I think, you know, there are definitely, again, it's an educational piece of, can we look at skills? Can we look at how people could learn those like really applicable skills in a role outside of the traditional education system as well? I think that's really valid. Kate, do you have anything to add in terms of how Microsoft approaches that?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing very, very similar things. And I think what's interesting right now, particularly when we think about the talent market and just the volume of applications, when you're, you know, the tension between saying, hey, we really need to broaden that aperture, we need to really think about not limiting the talent pool, yet at the same time, we're all being deluged with applications, and how that really manifests itself in that kind of hiring process. So I think, you know, though, again, I go back to that recruiter capability of being on that front foot, to be in that position of educating and advising around the impact that some of this language makes is super duper important. And the second thing I will say is that we know that the advert isn't the only place. And so increasingly we know that, well, hey, they're going to go back and check you out on another platform, maybe Flexa, hopefully, or maybe other places. And so really doubling down in the job adverts, but also thinking about our site, making sure it's accessible, making sure that we are, to your point, Reena, having diverse representation in the imagery and the videos that we have, so that we're really creating that holistic kind of picture at that top end of the and the organisation that we really aspire to be.
Yeah, and being honest and transparent about that, right? Because I think something that now we are starting to get more comfortable with in the market is the idea that, you know, employer brands and companies are meant to put off people as well as attract people. So then you're not optimizing for getting as many applications as possible. You're optimizing for getting relevant applications from people that are going to thrive in that environment. And it's a topic that comes to a bit later, but there is a slight tension in terms of like putting people off, but also being inclusive. And I think we can dig into that a little bit afterwards. But Reena, I'd love to hear from you about kind of advice that you would give from a neurodivergence perspective of like how companies can look at their hiring processes and writing their job adverts as well.
I love what's been said already, and so much of it is what I would have said. So keeping your language really clear, really focusing on actually what skills do you need, because typically with neurodivergent people, with that can often come anxiety, and they're less likely to look at an advert and think, oh, I probably can do that. If it looks like it's something that's not within their skill set, they'll just rule it out. So be really clear on what it is you need for that particular role, and splitting it out into must-haves and nice-to-haves is a great way of doing that as well. I'd say in terms of attraction, if you can talk about any flexible options that are available, then do, whether that's remote work or whether that's flexible hours or customizable workspaces or whatever that is. That's all good stuff. So it's almost like preempting all of the most obvious reasons why a neurodivergent person may be put off applying. And a great way to sense check how that's reading is literally making sure that the people involved in creating that job advert are neurodivergent or have living experience of it, and also other intersecting identities too.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. Like, don't assume what somebody else will think or what somebody else will experience, and actually get real feedback and open up those conversations.
Yeah.
Super. So from an inclusive hiring perspective, obviously, I feel like over the last 5 years, we have made quite a lot of progress. And it feels like we're getting more comfortable having these conversations and more comfortable educating, but we still have such a long way to go, right? So I'd love to hear your opinions on like where and how do you see inclusive hiring practices evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? And how is your organisation preparing for those changes? We've already touched upon skills-based hiring, which I think is going to be a really big theme within that. Reena, I'd love to hear from you.
I'll keep this short because I suspect Kate and Raj will have way more to add. I think we're going to end up using a lot more AI, but my fear is that AI is programmed by people, and people have biases and assumptions. Yeah. So the AI will only be as good as the information which is inputted. So on the one hand, it's exciting because you potentially could have a very impactful assessment system which won't, be prejudice people because of their name or because of other things about them. But at the same time, at the moment, I don't think we're in a space where AI is unbiased. So, that's I guess what I think about that. But what I would like to see more of is, in order to get more underrepresented groups, more neurodivergent people, and people from other marginalized populations having access to work, is building those relationships as early as possible. So with school leavers, and organizations at that point, in order to facilitate that pipeline of talent in the future.
Creating that, exactly, that early stage pipeline, making sure that we are bringing people through from the very beginning, rather than realizing, as I said, suddenly, oh God, we've got a diversity crisis in senior leadership in 10 years' time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kate, what would you add to that? Like, where do you see inclusive hiring kind of moving over the next 5 or 10 years, and what does Microsoft think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a really interesting. I just think, where is hiring going to be? I mean, let's just take the inclusive up, because, I mean, you made a great point. The ecosystem within which we're operating right now is probably presents us with probably the biggest change that we're going to experience. We've got AI. We know we've got massive amounts of kind of compliance changes in legislation that are coming around as well. We also know that the market is, as I said earlier, really sort of candidate heavy at the moment. And so actually knowing what will happen with AI, I don't think any of us really clear on actually what that is going to look like. My aspiration is that actually AI helps us become less biased, actually, and is a kind of alleviator for some of that stuff. But if I think about my hope, is that actually we sort of, that point earlier around moving from compliance to conviction to culture, that actually inclusive hiring is just the way that we do things, fundamentally. And that would be where I'd hope that we would sort of land, that this is just part of our, around how we operate on a normal day-to-day.
Completely agree with that. I think it would be wonderful to be in a position where people no longer see it as, taking away from somebody to give to another, and instead we see an opportunity to make the pie bigger and to be able to just give it a more equal share to more people. And I think that's ultimately the direction that we want to go if we're talking about getting more, say, returning mothers into work, or more people with disabilities or neurodivergent individuals. Like, the opportunity to, particularly with flexible working, I think, to open up employment to people that otherwise have not been able to access it is absolutely huge. I think that the UK government did a study where over the next 3 years, if we adopt more flexible working practices, signpost more when, a company is open to part-time working or open to job sharing, whatever it might be, we could add an estimated 40 billion to the UK economy because of people that are excluded from the workforce, because of the way that work was, hopefully we're evolving now, but because of the way that work was done. So I think that's such an exciting opportunity. Raj, would you have anything to add there in terms of like where you see hiring or inclusive hiring evolving to over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think it would be really good to get into, in terms of the inclusive hiring practices, how does that become a norm in terms of the process? And then you're not thinking, well, how do I do this, or what do I need to do to attract this group of people? Yeah. Everything is just in the normal practices of doing things. And we have recently done a career returners program. And again, the mindset changes for the managers to get them bought into that was huge.
Yeah.
But it was promoting roles that we have and looking more at that skills-based hiring for people who have been out of work for at least 18 months or more for various reasons.
Yeah.
And I think with the first cohort, we had 21 people, I think, in terms of the offers that we made. And I think the person who'd been out of work the longest was something like 22 years. And they've kind of, what they bring back into the organisation was huge.
Yeah, I think that's the alternative working patterns, and looking at that, I think, is really going to be a focus in terms of how can we get people's skills into the workforce that otherwise we'd be excluding, all sorts of different working patterns that we've spoken to companies, that we have people on 4-day weeks here, alternative, like how can we get them in, but how it also balances what they need in their lives, because there are so many wonderfully skilled people out there that are struggling with that 5-day a week in office, same hours every day, and that doesn't work for everybody, right?
And some of the one of the major challenges around any kind of skill-based hiring or skill-based organisation is historically been kind of demand planning, and the fact that it's really difficult. And so if AI could, the hope of AI would be that we actually get much better at that, then the downstream implications around offering different types of working patterns, being able to, not even proactively, but as a norm, be able to offer different types of propositions, it could be enormous.
And if we're focusing on, that top of funnel awareness and that top of funnel proactive pipeline building, that sort of demand planning becomes obviously still a concern. But if you've always got tens of thousands of people that want to work for you, and you open up one application and all of a sudden you've got hundreds of brilliantly relevant people that are there, that obviously solves that problem in terms of like, when we start hiring, we're not going to have somebody in for another 3 months, whatever it might be. So being able to really focus top of funnel and build up that pipeline is a huge opportunity. And I hope that there'll be a big focus on how we use employer branding to improve transparency, to enable people to make an educated decision about whether that company is right for them. And then you even get companies individuals like pre-application loyalty. Lots of people have a list of like 10 companies that they would love to work for because of the way that they've portrayed themselves, whether they've really identified with a piece of content or they love the sound of a working environment. We're very fortunate to have that at Flexa, and very often we'll have people that have followed us for a year or two, really wishing that they could work for us, and then a role comes up, and that's a very, very exciting position to be in. And I do hope that that's the way that hiring goes, where it's like dating, you disclose what's important to you, they disclose what's important to them, and then you meet kind of eventually at some point in time. We've got a few questions and 15 minutes left, so I'd love to go over to the questions that have appeared in the chat. We've got an interesting one, and that's why I didn't want to kind of dive into it. I mentioned it before, asking, well, we know that not every company environment is right for every employee, but how do we deal with that when we're talking about wanting to appeal and cater for a diverse workforce, and obviously embrace inclusive hiring? Because I think at face value, there's a potential that could be seen as a bit of a tension of wanting to put people off, but also wanting to be really inclusive. Reena, I feel like you might have some thoughts from a neurodivergence angle, and would love to hear them.
So not every company environment is right for every employee. I mean, I guess I would struggle to identify a company that wouldn't be right for a neurodivergent employee. Neurodivergent people typically have spiky profiles, extreme strengths in some areas, and perhaps more, some areas of development or challenge in others. And the skill sets and strengths are often, can be utilized across multiple industries. So it could be creativity, it could be hyperfocus, it could be, and the list goes on. So I'm not sure if the question is, what if you've got particular roles that would be less suitable? So if you say, for example, got a role which has to be customer facing full-time 5 days a week, and I can see how for some neurodivergent people that might not, that might be quite exhausting. I'm trying to answer your question, but I realize I might be sounding like I'm not answering your question. I think I don't think there's a broad brush statement around this type of work is not suitable for that type of person. I can't,
I think within the question, and I could be interpreting it wrong, but how I would interpret that is around, some people want to work in a hybrid way. Some people want to work fully remotely. Some people really value being able to work from anywhere. Some people love to bring their dog to the office. Like there's a real personal preference around how we work now, and a lot less homogeneity when we look at the working environment versus 5 years ago. And so it's interesting being very transparent about that. If you're dog friendly, then people that hate dogs can't work for you, to put it in the simplest terms. So how do you approach that as a company? Raj, I'd love to come to you from a BT perspective of being authentic and honest and showcasing to people what you're like.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have policies for everything. And I guess it's really difficult to have policies for everything to suit everybody's needs. But I think the key is how can you be open to, if there is a certain, I don't know, a particular thing like bringing your dog to work day that you wanted, or that's a benefit to you. How do you voice your opinion? How do you create? I think it's more about creating a culture where you can openly bring ideas forward or challenge, well, actually, I think this will be good for me in terms of this is what I'm about. How do you create a policy for this? Because I think more and more organisations are moving away from the purely work from home culture and going to that more hybrid function, which doesn't suit everybody, but how do you make sure it's flexible within that? So if you do need to, I don't know, start later and finish early, how do you accommodate that for the people? And if you don't feel like that accommodates for you, how is that culture embedded into your organisation to be able to speak up and not be, I guess, that's not held against you, and it's actually the feedback is heard.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's being clear with what's on offer, but also welcoming those conversations. And it's very interesting from a startup's perspective, because for us, the startup environment isn't for everybody. There's a massive lack of structure. There won't be, when some people are like, I like to know what my job description is and what I'm meant to be doing. That doesn't exist in a startup. It's very fast paced. It's very lumpy in terms of kind of workload. And so it's very interesting for us. We've learned over time that actually the best way to identify people that will thrive in that, and there's definitely no thread of, it suits a certain type of person. It's more that when you have a very honest and open conversation, and I have a conversation in every final interview with people, and I explain what it's like to work at Flexa, and some people are like, oh, that sounds amazing. And others, you can see their faces, they're a bit like, oh, I'm not sure. But I think it's that very open and easy conversation of like, it's okay for this not to be for you. And it's also okay if it really is, and you love the sound of that. And it's about that kind of opting into working together and seeing it as a working together rather than working for all the time. Kate, would you add anything from Microsoft's perspective?
Well, I'm laughing because it's a bit of a continuation of your matchmaking that you were talking about earlier. But it is really like, I think it's okay to be transparent. So if I was sort of reading the question and also trying to think where it's going, but we have roles that sit within in our data center operations, for example, that have to be 5 days a week, and that is what they have to be, and so that's okay. I think the important thing is not to assume, right, that a certain demographic cannot do certain X, Y, Z. And I think that's where we just again need to lean on that kind of inclusive hiring capabilities that we've all built to say this is the proposition. But to your point, let's go and have a matchmaking conversation to see whether this is going to suit us both. But let's be really clear on both sides what those parameters within which we need to work are.
Yeah. And I think that's so important, is that highlighting of it's not to say there's a certain demographic or a certain person that won't fit with. I think there's very often this expectation that by companies being very transparent and very open, and I've heard it from so many people, I find it so frustrating. They're like, but if I'm transparent about this, then I'm going to get people that want to take advantage of that. Then I'm going to get people that they only want they want to work flexibly because they're lazy, or they want this because they want to understand the maternity policy because they want to have a baby right now. Those kind of misconceptions, rather than people trying to educate themselves. And I think that's something that's very important to grapple with and to re-educate, is actually often either it's necessity, somebody has certain circumstances in their lives that they cannot work around. They're not going to arrive in your company and demand that you change. Very often they'd rather go into somewhere where that's culturally accepted. Or it can be a sign of very, very high quality talent, because they have the ability to choose and the ability to demand more as well. So I think we need to change that kind of rhetoric around why people ask for transparency and why people ask for that kind of information.
And I think it just sorry, Reena.
Sorry, no, oh, I cut someone off, sorry. I was just going to say, and it can change.
Yeah.
So you might start and it's all fine, and circumstances change. The data around unpaid carers, working carers, and there's so many things that can happen in your life that can change that. But to Raj's point, be able to have that conversation, I would say, is much more important than whatever that initial conversation was, however many years ago.
Completely agree. Kate, did you want to add something there?
No.
I think it was me. Sorry. I think I was just going to say that even when you're advertising roles like part-time, full-time, part-time means different things to different people.
Yeah.
So how do you open that conversation and lead it more from a candidate perspective to say, actually, this is what I would need?
Yeah.
And see if you can then suit the needs of that job, as opposed to just leaving it as, I don't know, part-time is 2 days a week.
And signposting that you're open to that conversation, I think, is so important. Saying we are open to that conversation for some roles. Part-timers, come and chat to us, and that not making it a scary thing to overcome, and not feeling like by having that conversation you will be penalised and seen as less able, which I still think is a big stigma that we have to fight. Interesting question here around how do we ensure that managers receive the right training to support DEI efforts and create inclusive environments, particularly recruiting and retaining talent. Raj, you've already kind of touched on this, so I'd love to go to you first to go into a bit more detail around that.
Yeah, so I think it's number one, it's you first got to get the buy-in from the managers to attend the training, and making sure that, I guess, how do you make sure that it's easily accessible? And I'm going to be really open and honest that in previous organisations, when we've done something similar, we've kind of done maybe like a webinar and expected everybody to attend. And I guess the fallout from that is, if I'm not hiring right now, why would I attend this? So I'm just going to sit in the background. I'm not really going to listen. And when it comes to hiring, I have no idea where you've sent the pack for me to refer back to, and the same questions get answered again and again. So I think it's how do you provide some training to managers that's easily accessible, that can refer back to. So as an example, we have looked at things like little videos at the sides of the ATS system that come as a pop-up that say, actually, this is a reminder for you to do this, or X, Y, and Z. And previous organisations I've worked in have looked at things like a passport to recruit type of thing, and every manager has to go through a particular training before they're able to do, and they kind of govern that from the completion rate based on that as well. So I think there's loads of different techniques, but I guess the fundamental bit is, how do you get your hiring managers engaged to go on the journey with you to achieve the overall business strategy before you think about, well, actually, how do we do the training?
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point of making it kind of low lift and low effort and on demand, because you might, if you're not hiring now, but will be in 6 months, you won't see that as something that you need to focus your time and attention on. So that making it really low lift and easy and accessible. Kate, how do you approach it at Microsoft?
Yeah, I mean, I love the point. I mean, I think our managers generally just have such a big responsibility within any organisation. You imagine they've just got 1,000,001 things coming at them all the time. And so I think you're right, like knowing when is that point of need and having something that's on demand. So we have inclusive hiring training that is a video on demand. They can plug and play when they need to, which is just brilliant. Is really important. We track consumption of that and completion rate. So again, it's that kind of lean to, let's be accountable. Let's look at how we're doing around that. And I think just remembering that it's never a once and done. Because as we said, 25% of our hiring managers are doing one hire per year. 50%, I think, of our hiring managers had joined within the last couple of years. So again, it's like, how do we make sure that we're doing this on an ongoing basis and we embed it into the systems and practices that we have?
Yeah. Reena, do you have anything to add in terms of how we ensure that managers are trained up correctly to understand and implement diverse and inclusive hiring strategies?
So, I mean, for me, I think the companies that do it well have the managers are bought into why they're doing it. So it's not just, okay, I'm hiring, but now I need to hire inclusively. It's just another thing to do. When they're bought into the values and the direction of the company and why this is good for them, they're more inclined to then do the training. And, you know, the research shows that managers continue to be the number one source of support for neurodivergent employees over and above HR, ERGs and any other support mechanisms, you know, the counselling helplines or anything else you've got, your employee benefits providers. It's still the managers who are the number one point of call. So if you know that as a manager, if you realise how much power you have to create an environment that is inclusive, I think that would really incentivise you, because people want to do a good job. No one comes to work wanting to not do a good job. So I think bringing managers into the why really will help to get that buy-in to the webinars, to the e-learning, to whatever the mechanism is that you choose to embed inclusive hiring.
Yeah, it's very, very good advice. We've got one last question, and actually perfectly timed, 4 minutes left. So changing legacy mindsets can be so difficult, particularly when they're kind of embedded in organizations. So have we got any tips on how to help to make those culture shifts and help to educate people and change their mindsets around diversity? And I think going full circle, making sure that it's no longer seen by people as a tick box exercise or something that would take away from them. Reena, I can see you nodding there. Would you like to start?
I've been nodding throughout because it's all resonating. It's all good. I think what I would say is assume the best in people. I know that, yes, we're creatures of habit. We like to do things a certain way. However, sometimes, you know, there are people who, if neurodiversity has never been a part of their world or their dialogue, they can actually continue not having to engage with that as a topic. So, you know, bring it in a way which is from compassion as opposed to criticism. I think if you approach any kind of changing of mindset through castigation or shaming or anything, you're just not going to get that heart-centered buy-in. And use stories. I think stories are a great way to really showcase that difference. You know, acknowledge that, yes, however many years ago, neurodiversity, for example, was just not in our vocabulary. And it was, you know, it was very much restricted to the medical field, and that we understand that this can feel like it's come out of nowhere. It's always existed, and it's just giving that context, I think, I guess basically coming at it with assuming that, you know, the best of intention, as opposed to sometimes as well our own biases and assumptions are that people don't want to change, and that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, that's very true. I think sometimes we assume that people harboring maybe views that we see as less educated or less progressive means that they don't want to change or that it's a bad person, whereas actually no, it's just an education piece in the fact that maybe they've not been exposed to those views or those people or those perspectives before. So opening that conversation is crucial. Kate, would you have anything to add in terms of like how we can change people's perceptions and really change the kind of legacy mindsets that often exist in organizations?
Yeah, I'm looking at this question. I mean, it's massive, and it could take like an hour on this question. But I think one of the things that's really powerful at Microsoft is D&I is one of our cultural attributes, right? So it's embedded within our organization, not even within it. So we operate from a place of privilege around that. But each and every employee has a D&I core priority, right? Which is not about hiring or any of it necessarily about hiring, but what is the one step I'm going to take as an employee to activate or be curious about D&I within just being a corporate citizen, you know, of Microsoft, right? And I think what that then encourages is less this you have to do or you have to come on this really huge journey, but what is the one simple thing that I can activate as an individual and to make that journey? So I think that's something to think about.
Yeah, I love that one piece of good that you can do to change people's perceptions. Raj, I will bring to you to close and have our final word. What would you add in terms of advice or tips for this question?
I think very similar. I think I love the kind of the user story piece, and I guess some people on this call may be sitting there thinking, well, if we haven't got a user story to share because we haven't got that far in the process, where do we start? And I think don't be afraid to use other user stories from other organisations where they have had maybe a powerful story. I think we use that in terms of signposting, maybe, I guess, things that have led to maybe fines before. If we do recruitment wrong, as an example, don't be afraid to use it in this way from a positive perspective to be able to sell that story in. And I think similar to what Kate said, it's kind of in our everything in what we do at BT. We're constantly talking about how we can be a more inclusive workforce. So everybody does have an ownership to make a contribution, whether that's to hiring or not, or retention or whatever that may be. So using those user stories, I think, is really powerful.
Thank you so much. I think, we've covered a lot of ground on a topic that probably deserves so much more time and attention, but I hope that everybody listening took a lot away from this and lots of things to think about. And obviously, as always, there's a lot of a way to go, but it's really inspiring to hear all of your opinions and all of the amazing work that you're doing. And please do, to the audience, check out Microsoft and BT on Flexa and all of the amazing work they're doing from an inclusive hiring perspective. And as we all agreed on, let's hope that in 5 years time, optimistically, we're just talking about hiring, not just inclusive hiring.